Hi there, and thank you for attending today's presentation. My name is Dan Tratensek. I'm the Chief Operating Officer with the North American Hardware and Paint Association. The North American Hardware and Paint Association is the not-for-profit association that represents the interests of independent home improvement and paint and decorating retailers throughout the United States and Canada. Our mission is pretty simple as an association. We're over 120 years old, and it really hasn't changed. Our mission is to help independent home improvement, paint, and decorating retailers, regardless of any kind of affiliations they may have, become better and more profitable retailers. How do we serve that mission? We really have three different ways that we do it. We do it through education, through advocacy, and through association. What we mean by that is we educate retailers on everything they would need to know to serve home improvement consumers. That is everything from teaching frontline employees the difference between tools or the product knowledge in general that they need to provide the service that customers have come to expect, to senior level management and ownership training programs that are more at a collegiate level, that teach more strategy-based sessions, everything from business acquisition theory to strategic planning for businesses. We also advocate for the independent home improvement businesses and paint and decorating retailers serving the channel. That means we act as a voice for those 45,000 different independent retailers that are serving the channel to other channel partners. We go out and we survey and we talk to the independent retailers in this channel to understand what their challenges and needs are, and we share that with the other channel partners they may have, like manufacturers or distributors who work so closely with them to be successful. We also ask as a voice of advocacy for the independent retailers in more umbrella matters, things that are more important at a larger level, like legislation, laws, fair business practices, and promoting shop local to consumers around North America. Lastly, our last pillar is association, and we bring together retailers of all types to share ideas, to discuss concepts, to share challenges, and to share their best practices so that they can become better and stronger together. Again, getting back to our industry overview, there's been a lot of things changing in the industry, and it's been a very productive 18 months, yet a very challenging 18 months for the industry. So to set the stage, I want to talk to you a little bit about the overall home improvement industry in the United States. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the different players in the market and how they contribute to the overall sales for the industry. Then I want to walk you through the next outlook for what we see in the near future and look backwards to the last 18 months to really talk about some of the turmoil, challenges, and opportunities that have presented themselves to the market. First off, let's discuss the size of the overall U.S. home improvement industry. In total, the U.S. home improvement industry represents approximately $457 billion U.S. in sales in 2020. These sales flow through a channel that includes both big box chain retailers and independent retailers. Historically, the home improvement market in the United States increases at an annual rate of about 3.5% to 4.5% per year. And that's been pretty consistent for the last several decades. Some years have been off during the recession of the 2008-2010 timeframe. Obviously, the industry was softer, but then it made some of that up. So when we look at an average increase, it's usually running between 3.5% to 4.5% annually. Home improvement retailers in the U.S. really fall into a number of different forms, and these are how we define those home improvement retailers in the U.S. So when we talk about that a little further, you'll have a good understanding of what we're talking about. First off, you have the hardware stores. Hardware stores in the U.S. typically are smaller and serve a smaller geographic trading area. By our definition, hardware stores carry core lines of home repair, renovation, maintenance products. This includes things like fasteners, tools, plumbing and electrical supplies, hand tools, power tools, outdoor living, lawn and garden, plumbing, those kinds of things. The stores carry little to no lumber or building materials just by our definition of hardware stores. And they can range in footprint, anything from 1,500 square feet all the way up to 20, 30,000 square feet. We don't put a classification for a hardware store on this footprint size of the actual physical building. Next up, we categorize home centers. And home centers are very similar to hardware stores. And this group of stores would include the more commonly known big box retailers like Home Depot, Lowe's, and Menards. Home centers also carry a full line of hardware and home improvement products, fasteners, tools, power tools, outdoor living, lawn and garden, plumbing, electrical, all those sorts of types of things. But in addition to that, the home centers, under our definition, also offer lumber and building materials. But to be categorized as a home center under our definition, you have to have a minimum square foot of selling area that is under roof of 10,000 square feet. Next up are the lumber yards. Lumber yards primarily do their business in lumber and building materials. However, they can also have, and many of them do, under roof sales areas that offer things like tools and fasteners and other products that go along and are complementary to the lumber and building materials they sell. Our classification for lumber yards is that you get to garner your primary business from lumber and building material sales, but you have a sales floor that is under roof that is less than 10,000 square feet. And that's the differentiation between a home center and a lumber yard by our definition. Lastly, we have paint stores. And these are stores that primarily focus on selling the core categories of paint and decorating, which would be paint tools, painting products, accessories that go along with building and maintaining paint projects. What I want to discuss before we move into a little bit more specifics about the size of market is our methodology on how we come up with the figures that we quote. Because you'll notice that the figures that we use at NHPA are slightly different than what the U.S. government produces and what some other research organizations present when they discuss the size of the U.S. home improvement market. So I want to talk a little bit about how we get to our numbers. At NHPA, we use a variety of research resources when developing our size of market numbers. We do something annually called our Cost of Doing Business survey. We survey thousands of actual independent home improvement retailers and ask them to provide us with detailed financial data about their operations, including sales increases, and other productivity measures. That plays a large part in how we determine some of our size of market numbers. We also produce 2 magazines through our association, Hardware Retailing Magazine and Paint and Decorating Retailer Magazine. To produce these magazines, we invest a lot of money in circulation, where we actually send those magazines to. And a lot of that research is direct outreach to the different store owners and storefronts throughout the United States. And they provide us feedback as part of that research on how many locations they have, how many individuals are working in their operation, and their sales statistics. We also compile data from the United States Department of Commerce and Census bureaus and the annual and monthly retail reports that they issue. We discuss sales productivity with the industry's wholesalers and independents. We also keep in close contact with large groups of retailers throughout the United States who regularly report their sales data back to us. And all of our information we gather also includes information from the publicly traded home improvement companies like Home Depot, Lowe's, and Menards. So our size of market reports are based on sales for U.S. companies at retail, sales to both the professional and consumer channel in home improvement, so contractors, tradesmen, remodelers, as well as consumers and DIYers, sales through companies whose primary business is home improvement. A lot of home improvement activity can also take place through companies like Walmart or Target, more general purpose retailers that also carry some home improvement reports. When we drill down into more specific numbers for our industry, we try and leave those figures out. So let's take a look at the numbers. Based on our research, we showed that sales for 2020 in the U.S. home improvement industry totaled about $457 billion. And as I said earlier, we typically see the home improvement industry increase at an annual pace of about 3.5% to 4.5%. Well, in 2020, that pace was much more brisk. We actually recorded a 12.4% year-over-year sales increase from 2019. And it's fair to point out that after the ending of the first quarter, we're likely going to be revising those 2020 numbers to reflect an even higher sales increase in 2020. But as we were looking at the end of 2020, it came in at $457 billion. And we were anticipating that 2021 would see a slight decline of about 700 basis points to total about $453.8 billion in sales in this year. And if you look forward over the next 4 to 5 year period, you will see by 2024, we anticipate sales to top out at just over $510 billion per year. And we also see that pace returning to the average 3.5% to 4.5% annual growth rate. But that represents a compound annual growth rate from 2019 to 2024 of about 4.6% for the U.S. home improvement industry. Now, I like to illustrate some of the other views of the industry that we get out there from other industry colleagues, and so we'll look at that next. There's another organization in the United States called the Home Improvement Research Institute, and based on their numbers, we're about in line with their overall size of market estimates, but let's walk through those a little bit. In 2020, they felt that the industry was coming in at about $439.9 billion in sales. And they thought that there would also be about a 1.5% increase in sales in 2021 to total about $446.4 billion. And as you can see, they also recorded a large increase in sales over 2019 at a rate of about 8.7%. And they are anticipating that the 5-year compound annual growth rate for the industry will come in at about 4.7%. Let's take a look at what the U.S. Census Bureau is reporting from the official government numbers on sales through home improvement. Now, while they don't look predictively out forward at what they might anticipate to see in sales, they do look back, and I want to just state that as a way to frame our overall market outlook. In 2019, they thought the industry measured $384.5 billion, which they saw as a 1.9% increase over sales in 2018. But to just further support the point that we feel that sales in the industry typically increase at about 3.5% to 4.5%, you can look backwards over the last 5-year stretch, and you could see that roughly that average would come into play, about 3.5% to 4.5% annual increase for the industry since 2014. So normally, we would predict that moving forward, we would see that kind of same clip in the industry in the near future. But there's a lot of this changed in the last 18 months, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, that might interrupt or disrupt the cadence for increases in sales in the industry as we move into the next 5-year period. But before we get into that, let's take a little closer look at the players in the industry at the retail level. To better understand how these sales are distributed, let's take a look at the market share profile for the industry. Now, here in this chart, we have it broken down by the share of the industry that is represented by sales and store counts for the top chains. If you look at these charts on the left, it is the top chain. So that's the top 10 chains in the industry at retail, which would include Home Depot, Lowe's, and Menards, and the other 7 kind of fluctuate back and forth between regional chains. And on the left, you're looking at their share of sales in the industry and their number of stores. And in 2019, you could see that the top 10 chains in the United States represented about 51.3% of the overall sales generated at retail through the industry. However, that same group only represented about 15% of the storefronts in the industry. The balance of sales and the balance of storefronts are made up from all those independent stores that are dotting the landscape throughout the United States. So if you look at it as a dollar figure, you can see that the net sales in 2019 generated by the top 10 chains in the U.S. was roughly $208.5 billion. And the number of storefronts was about just a little over 6,000. When you look at their individual performance, here are the companies that we're looking at that make up the top chains in the United States. Home Depot is still king of the hill and has the greatest annual sales volume and the greatest number of stores, followed closely by Lowe's and Menards. Then we look at companies like Tractor Supply, 84 Lumber, Northern Tool and Equipment, Carter Lumber, and Sutherland Lumber. Let's talk a little bit about these top 3 players. The top 3 players are, as you can see by the previous chart, really amount for the vast majority of sales through retail in the industry. And you first have the leader of the pack, the Home Depot. Home Depot was opened in 1978, based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and in 1981 really became a publicly traded company. And then In 1984, they moved to the New York Stock Exchange. The company has stores throughout the United States, Canada, Mexico, China, really all over the world. And the stores average, these are big stores, about 105,000 square feet, and garden areas that measure about 23,000 square feet. In October of 2020, the company announced that Edward P. Decker would serve as its new president and chief operating officer. And in November, Home Depot announced it would acquire HD Supply and grow its presence in the maintenance, repair, and operations space. The company has been seeing sharp sales increases amid the COVID-19 pandemic. And overall, in fiscal year 2020, the company reported sales of $132 billion, nearly a 20% increase from what they saw in 2019. 2020 sales of $132.1 billion, up 19.9% over 2019. Net income of $2.9 billion in 2020, a 16% increase. Comp store sales growth, also almost 20%. So you can see that Home Depot had a very strong 2020. And because they control so much of the market, you can see why overall the market for home improvement in the United States in 2020 was really outpacing what we would regularly see. By the numbers, Home Depot employs over 400,000 employees, and they have almost 2,300 stores across the U.S. Lowe's has always been second behind Home Depot in recent years when it comes to home improvement chain activity. They were older than Home Depot. They were founded in 1946, and they grew from a small rural hardware store to an international home improvement chain, and became publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange in 1961. So they really led the way in front of Home Depot, but they didn't expand as rapidly as Home Depot did throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The average Lowe's store is just a little bit larger than your average Home Depot at about 120,000 square feet. And they also stock around 36,000 items. They also offer more than 50 interior and exterior installation services. That's been a big area where both Home Depot and Lowe's have grown in recent years, is through their service offering. In May 2018, Lowe's hired Marvin Ellison as their president and CEO, and he replaced retiring chairman and CEO Bob Niblock. Ellison has really taken Lowe's through a bit of a renaissance in the last several years, trying to kind of redefine how Lowe's stood up differently than Home Depot in the market space. In 2020, the company opened 50 cross-docking facilities and 7 bulk distribution centers and 4 e-commerce fulfillment centers. Lowe's also saw its profits rise, much like Home Depot did throughout 2020, and net sales for the year hit $89.6 billion, a 24% increase over what they saw in 2019. So, a little bit by the numbers for Lowe's, $89.6 billion in sales, up nearly 27%. Net income of $5.8 billion, up 34.9% from 2019. And comp store sales up 28.6% from 2019. So from this measure, you can see that Lowe's in many ways outpaced the performance of Home Depot 2019 to 2020. And in large part, this can be attributed to some of the changes that Marvin Ellison had made in the way Lowe's is approaching the market space. The last major player from the big boxes is Menards. And Menards is a little bit of an odd company in a sense that, unlike Home Depot and Lowe's, they are not publicly traded. They are a privately owned company, and they have still a regional presence. They are still not across the entire United States, and they have about 316 stores as of October 2018. They are a very private company, so they don't share sales figures. They don't share information about new openings. They don't share much with anyone outside of the company. So a lot of the numbers when it comes to Menards are estimates on how they're performing. Menards has always been focused more on measured growth. And each one of the Menards stores are much larger than the competition. Some are up to 200,000 square feet, and they even have some that are in excess of 250,000 square feet across 2 levels. In 2020, Menards had sales of approximately $15 billion, according to our estimates. Next, beyond the chain stores that service the channel, The biggest single operating unit that accounts for sales through the channel is this melange of independently owned home improvement stores. Independent home improvement retailers in home improvement in the United States have an enormous impact on the overall home improvement channel. They have large sales volume, deep community bonds, and a sizable brick and mortar footprint throughout the industry. After the sales surges in 2020, independent home improvement businesses account for more sales than any leading big box. So in 2020, as we compile those numbers, the independent segment is going to overtake the top 10 chains in terms of percentage of sales in the industry. And in 2020, independent home improvement retailers represented roughly 50%, slightly more than the other chains combined. When you talk about number of stores, 2020, we estimate there were a total of 42,733 independent stores in the United States. That means 9 out of every 10 home improvement locations in the United States is independently owned. And in addition to the sizable contribution to the overall industry sales, independent operators have that huge brick and mortar footprint. You could see by the number of locations that just about any community in the United States has an independent home improvement store representing its market space. Let's talk a little specifically about 2020 and what we saw develop, because it was such an interesting year to follow. And there's obviously no way you could tell the story of 2020 in home improvement without discussing on the role of COVID-19 and what it played on the industry. So let's look back a little bit. It was early March in 2020 that it was really most businesses and most households were operating in the United States as business as usual. Then that's when late winter, early spring, when the pandemic began spreading more openly across the United States, and we really got the first signs that this was going to be more than just a small issue for business and individuals in the United States. And in early March is when you saw a lot of communities beginning to close down, beginning to create restrictions for operations of businesses and the way consumers could engage with businesses or really interact with one another. It was actually March 16th that NRHA and industry leaders crafted a letter that was sent to state and provincial and federal governments in the United States. And the reason I point this out is because this effort was really instrumental in encouraging local government and federal government to allow home improvement stores to remain open throughout the pandemic. It was our contention, along with many other leading companies in the industry, that home improvement businesses were essential to the operation of communities and to the upkeep of households throughout the nation. And we were very thankful when most communities throughout the United States did decree that home improvement stores would be considered essential businesses and would be allowed to stay open during the pandemic. And I just point this out because in other parts of the world, this was not necessarily the case. And this really fed into the ability for this industry to sustain sales and grow sales at the pace they did in 2020. As communities began issuing stay-at-home orders and asking non-essential business to shut down, home improvement stores, we are pleased to say, were deemed essential. So what were some of the immediate impacts of what was happening with the pandemic on the home improvement industry in the United States? Well, homeowners faced this new normal where the home in the United States took on a completely different role as opposed to going out and traveling and engaging in entertainment outside the home. Most homeowners were now nesting, what we call nesting, which is staying in place in the home and doing improvements on their home and making changes to their home. And the home took on a new meaning. It was now where you lived, but it was also in many cases where you worked, as most individuals had to work from home. And as most school districts shut down, most students were now also, and children were also in the home 24 hours a day and receiving schooling in the home. And retailers really had to adapt to meet these new consumer demands, and they were able to do so quickly. So early on, by April or May of 2020, we saw sales increases in home improvement in the United States really outpacing significantly that 3.5% to 4.5% increase that we typically see. And we started drilling down on what were the projects that consumers were engaging in that were driving these sales increases. And three things really cropped up. One was this concept of working from home. Now, most consumers across the United States had their offices on lockdown. They were not allowed to go into the office to work. So they were having to create spaces in their home where they could work and be productive. And oftentimes, this meant buying storage, buying or painting small rooms, buying furniture and things that you needed to create that work environment in your home. Other employees or other consumers who couldn't necessarily work and just had to stay home found themselves at home with a lot of time on their hands. So they began catching up on those home improvement projects that they had perhaps let lapse for a while. And this bucket of sales and home improvement was heavily weighted towards small projects like paint, plumbing, electrical, and some lawn and garden. Then you had a lot of the sales that were directly related to COVID-19. And this included sales for things like disinfecting and cleaning supplies, personal protective equipment, home safety, and home cleaning supplies that would also typically flow through home improvement stores. So let's dig a little bit deeper into 2020 and some of the results that we saw. Throughout 2020, retailers were reporting strong sales increases across almost every market. Typical sales increases, and we showed you earlier that the big boxes were experienced, were also being experienced by those independent retailers. And increases ran from the high teens to the low mid-20s throughout the entire year of 2020. And currently, as we're looking back at 2020, the average stores were seeing increases on the order of 24.2%. And initially, retailers braced for these increases to fall off. Throughout the entire year, they kept thinking, these sales increases aren't going to last. These sales increases aren't going to last. But they continued to last and persist throughout the year. In 2020, we saw that a total of 87.2% of the retailers reported year-to-date sales increases over what they saw in 2019, with that average sales increase of 24.2%. 19.4% was the average increase we tracked for independent retailers across the country. So if you took out what some of the big boxes were seeing, the average independent retailer was seeing increases on the order of about 19.4%. And these increases in 2020 were unlike anything that we had seen to that point. I've been watching the industry for over 25 years, and while we've seen growth in the industry and periods of strong growth, we had never seen this amount of rapid growth concentrated into such a short period of time. The pandemic also served as a catalyst for operational changes for the retailers within the industry. It wasn't just keeping up with the sales increases, it was also fundamentally changing some of the things that they did in their operations. And we want to talk a little bit about that. So let's just talk about some of these operational challenges and other changes that occurred as a result of things that were directly happening because of the pandemic. Now, on one hand, you had business that had just rapidly surged during the last 3 quarters of the year. So retailers were having to deal with that additional business from all these new projects that homeowners were engaging in. But they also had to figure out things like, how do I manage my employees when I have to keep them safe? We have to keep our customers safe. Contact has to be limited. They were looking at other metrics and things that they would typically look at, like sales per customer, or managing their workforce based off productivity hours from employees. Those were all kind of out the window. And they had to develop things like buy online, pick up in the store where it didn't exist before, or curbside pickup where it didn't exist before. And these operational challenges were doubled by the fact that the industry was put under strain in general. This rapid and sudden influx of new business and new projects put a strain on the supply chain for the industry. Is that not only did you have sales increasing by double digits, but a lot of the supply chain was being stressed by things like raw material shortages from other parts of the world, challenges with getting product shipped, challenges with labor at distribution facilities and trucking. So retailers were really having to manage things on a lot of fronts that created additional challenges for them during this time. And even with those challenges, they still managed to record the kind of sales increases that they did. So there were also some economic things and opportunities that emerged for home improvement retailers in the United States. As consumers saw new priorities emerge, they were making new decisions about where to spend their disposable income. They didn't have as many options as they once did. They couldn't go out to restaurants. They couldn't go out to concerts. They couldn't go out to ball games. They could not travel. So most of their purchases were being concentrated in the home. Now, that leaves the question of what happens when things return normal. We'll get to that in just a second. The interesting thing that we also saw in the United States during the pandemic is our housing market activity remained strong. Houses were still being bought. Houses were still being sold. And that's when the majority of home improvement activity takes place in the United States. So it was very odd as we saw unemployment in the country increase. We didn't see the kind of detrimental impact that we would normally associate with that on the housing market. People were still in the market for purchasing houses, and we saw home prices increase. And when home prices increase, that gives consumers access to more of that equity from the home to engage in those home improvement projects. So it was really like a cycle for home improvement that continued to feed on itself. But this does leave some questions for the future. Now let's talk a little bit about what might be next. All of the numbers we look at, all of the empirical evidence does not indicate that there is any imminent slowdown for home improvement activity that would be fueled by the emergence from COVID-19. As I said earlier, throughout the entire pandemic, sales increased month over month and year over year from past performance. Retailers were very skittish about when will this come to an end? When will we see those increases declining? And it never came. Throughout, after the first quarter of 2020, sales increased steadily. And we've partnered with some other groups like Forensic Consumer Specialists, which is a research organization here in the United States that looks at consumer home improvement activity. And they reached out to consumers to ask them, how are your plans for home improvement projects changing? And what we found is there's really no plans to slow down, even when things begin to open up. So here we are in 2021. And what we found is that through the first quarter of 2021, we're hearing that retailers are comping sales at about 25 to 35% above what they posted in 2020. So we're still seeing this kind of rapid sales increases continuing through Q1, and that's at the big boxes and at the independent retailers. So for the industry as a whole, the critical question is, if you remember, as I said before, January, February, March. So the first quarter of 2020 those were pre-pandemic numbers. And we really didn't see those big increases, those 24.2% average increases that we saw through the last half of the year. They really didn't start coming till the May, June timeframe. So what we're going to see is this performance that is continuing to carry on and these strong comp sales numbers that we've seen during the first quarter. The question is going to happen is, as more things start to open up, as we start comping against some of the months from last year that were really being fueled by that post-pandemic activity, what's it going to look like? And the first month that we think that we're going to get some information and insight into that is going to be May, because May really across the entire United States was the first month where home improvement sales just exploded under COVID-19. So this month right now is going to be critical to how the industry is going to comp for the rest of the year. One of the good things that we're seeing right now is that retailers are also still holding their margins. Margins on products seem to be holding well. The real challenge right now presented to retailers are kinks in the supply chain. And this is not a problem that is strictly related to COVID. There are a lot of kind of things that have occurred at the same time that have put a continued strain on the home improvement supply chain. You had the increased demand from COVID. You had challenges with export and shipping. We all know what happened in the Suez Canal and the challenges that created. You have some areas in the United States at receiving ports like Long Beach and Texas, where they simply don't have enough people to offload the ships that need to be offloaded. We had a lot of dramatic winter weather issues in parts of the United States where a lot of production occurs, like Texas, where there's a lot of chemical plants that produce things like resin. All of these, the housing being so strong right now, all of them have placed very tight demand on lumber, building materials, resin, products. So right now, retailers' sales are very strong in the U.S., but supply chain and getting the products on the shelves is starting to become an issue. So what we're seeing is retailers reacting by increasing their inventory levels. They're opportunistically buying product where it is available. And we see that through the first quarter of 2021, retailers' inventory levels are about 10 to 15% higher than they were this time last year. And they're trying to manage those inventory challenges by increasing lead times and at some points limiting the amount of product that can be purchased through their stores by their customers. And from everyone we talk to, we don't see these challenges on the supply chain side leveling out anytime during 2021. So that leaves us asking, how is demand for products possibly going to change? And what we're hearing from homeowners is that 68% of homeowners indicate that they had started a new project within the last month. 70% said that the onset of COVID-19 had been a catalyst in them starting those projects. 60% said they're planning on starting DIY projects in the next few weeks. 59% are listing their local stores as the primary source for home improvement products. Comparable to 2019, that was 66%, which really indicates that many more people are turning to the internet right now to shop for their home improvement needs. And the good news for the independent stores that we work with is that when we ask what local stores are you turning to buy your projects, what we see is that under the pandemic, hardware stores and lumber yards account for the majority of the increase in person-to-person purchases being made even during COVID. So we think and see that independent stores on the hardware side and lumber side have actually gained market share from some of the chains during the pandemic. So what does this mean for home improvement? Overall, the United States, right now, home improvement stores and retailers still have great opportunities. Consumer confidence is increasing. The housing market is strong. And right now, consumers don't show us any indication that they're going to be slowing their home improvement investments, at least for the balance of 2021, even as we normalize more and emerge from the pandemic. The retailers in this channel have had to adapt and make changes operationally to meet the new needs of consumers. They're finding things like buy online, pick up in store, and curbside pickup more important than they ever have. And one thing that we've also seen is some of the numbers I quoted with the sales increases and the net profitability increases and the margin holding strong is that these retailers are having funds to invest in growth. That's either growing more stores, adding more product to the store where it is available, or looking for ways to improve their service offering. But the real key is going to be they still need support from the channel. These retailers in home improvement still need the supply chain to work on being able to deliver the products and get them to the stores so they can be able to sell them and support them in efforts like e-commerce growth, in new products and niches and new product rollouts so they have those products to keep customers interested once more distracting things emerge. Thank you. I appreciate your time today. Again, I'm Dan Tratensek, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer with the North American Hardware and Paint Association.